And I shall try now not to put you asleep again. I'm not sure I'll fail, but we'll try. We'll see. I'm not wearing any white trousers. I don't want to pretend to be the Queen, although I can't exclude that there are quite a number of Dutch queens who like to wear white trousers, but this is a completely different matter. Ladies and gentlemen, throughout history, there's always been a close connection between innovation in the field of energy and the geopolitical makeup of the world. In 1824, Nicolas Sadi-Carnot, son of one of Napoleon's war ministers, wrote Réflexion sur la puissance motrice du feu et sur les machines propres à développer cette puissance. Carnot was the first to comment on the great revolution that oil, coal and gas had set in motion. He argued that for the first time in history, humanity had broken free from the limitations of man and animals. The locomotive engineer, it was proclaimed, now held the power of 100,000 men in his hands. In 1939, two German scholars published a paper on Kernspaltung. Scientists were quick to see the implications of the discovery. Within 3 months, 18 scientific teams in 5 different countries confirmed the discovery and were feverishly thinking of ways to apply this new power. For succeeding generations, it was crystal clear that atomic power would revolutionize the world in the same way Carnot had predicted that fossil fuels would. But the collateral damage caused by nuclear power has been too high. Hiroshima, Chernobyl, and most recently Fukushima have cast a dark veil over its future. Nuclear energy will be part of our energy mix for generations to come, but I suppose that most countries will look for alternatives as soon as they can. Just when the world has come to terms with the continuing dominant position of oil and coal in the energy market, the United States made an unexpected move. They invested heavily in fracking, and although at first sight it seems only another way to produce more oil and gas, this invention is worthy of Carnot's label. It is a great revolution, once again. Fracking is a game changer, and energy strategists all over the world are thinking hard what the consequences would be. With shale gas, the United States now have a much cheaper and cleaner energy source than oil and coal. This will have consequences for the economic structure of the United States and thus strongly influence economic structures elsewhere, including in Europe. So the face of the world is changing. Geopolitical relations are shifting. We need to rethink our national and European energy, resources and climate policies. And we need to do so quickly. There is no time. Europe has to protect the welfare of its people, its security and its global position. But before I get to the solutions, let me run down some of the intricate underlying problems. The first of which is growing demand. The world's population will grow by 2 billion people in the next 20 years. This growth will take place largely in developing markets in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And over the next generation, many people on these continents will see an enormous rise in their paychecks. The middle class will grow by hundreds of millions, which is absolutely great news. You know, we're always focusing on the challenges this poses. Just imagine what a great success it is for these continents and these nations to see so many people moving up the income scale and reaching middle income. This is a dream come true for many of our previous generations who wanted this for everyone in the world. So if these people will move from an income below $10,000 a year to an income between $10,000 and $30,000 a year, it makes a world of difference. There is a song by Katie Melua, I think, 9 million bicycles in Beijing. Just imagine 9 million bicycles becoming 9 million motor cars in Beijing. and all these cars needing energy and gas, what this will mean for the demand in China alone. And people with higher income, they change their living patterns. They change their way they eat. They eat more meat, and more meat means more need for area to grow crops. You need more water. You need more animal feed. So the rise in the world's demand for resources, water, land, and energy will thus be enormous. Let us focus on energy. The increase in demand for energy in the next 2 decades alone will be greater than all the energy the world consumed in 1970. By 2030, the demand for energy will be 35 to 40% higher than it is today. This sounds challenging, but it's a challenge we can meet. The real problem is not that we're running out of fuel. The real problem are high prices, conflicts over resources, and environmental stress. Because new techniques, most importantly fracking, mean we can meet the world's increasing thirst for energy. The most important development in the energy market is the huge increase of gas and oil production in North America. For years, the exploration of shale gas and oil that is buried deep beneath the face of the earth in the US and Canada was deemed too costly for successful exploitation. But high oil prices in the last few years has totally changed the equation. Now shale gas has revolutionized the energy market. Where for decades the United States had to import 2/3 of the energy needed, now it will become an energy exporter again. The United States will be the biggest gas producer in 2015 and the biggest oil producing country in 2017. Because of fracking, the United States has a reserve of 6.5 trillion barrels compared to the 1.3 trillion in the Middle East. Shale gas has also been found in Algeria, Mauritania, Niger, and Mali. The price for gas in Europe is currently 3 times higher than it is in the United States. Asia pays 6 times as much, and the price of oil is rising as well. China and India will double their demand for energy over the next 2 decades. They get it mostly from the Middle East and Latin America. According to the International Energy Agency, in 2035, about 90% of all oil from the Middle East will go to Asia. And China is investing heavily in Latin America. The expansion of the Panama Canal with Chinese funding is a case in point. Broadly speaking, we can say that the oil trade is moving east. Let's take a look at Europe. At the moment, Europe imports 60% of its energy. In 2035, this will be 80%. Europe will have a hard time competing with China and India for oil from the Middle East. As energy expert Fatih Birol put it, the energy future of the EU will be shaped more in Beijing than in Brussels. Moreover, when energy gets more expensive, the prices of food and transport go up as well. This could hit our competitiveness. High energy prices are not good for investment. On the other hand, high energy prices are good for transformation and are also good for proximity to markets, with Europe in a prime position to profit from this. 500 million consumers, and they all want to buy stuff. They have high levels of income, even though we're going through a crisis. And if you have proximity to markets, that is good for Europe more so than for other markets. Energy markets do not function according to the laws of supply and demand. In the energy and resources trade, state companies dominate the market. We are witnessing resource nationalism. The state is back. And it is back with a vengeance. This is not a sector that Europe can outsource to private companies, even if some of them have balance sheets that are bigger than certain national budgets. Europe and the Netherlands have to address this issue by political and diplomatic means in support of and in addition to the activities of private companies. we shouldn't be naive about this. All across the world, the state remains in firm control of energy resources and energy markets. And we should be aware of this. We should organize ourselves as Europeans in a way that we can counter this when this is necessary, and in a way that we can become a player if it is necessary, and it will be increasingly necessary. One question you might ask is, why don't we ourselves start searching for shale gas? Well, we will be starting in that field all across Europe. You see the first moves, and even the Russians told me they are now looking for possibilities in that sector. I say even the Russians because they have so many other energy resources they can build upon. But for us it is more difficult in the Netherlands than in many other countries for obvious reasons. The natural circumstances, the fact that we are densely populated, and the fact that there are very complicated environmental issues such as the use of water. But my colleague, Minister of Economic Affairs, Henk Kamp, has ordered an investigation into the possibilities of fracking in the Netherlands. Let me turn to the issue of security. Increasing demand leads to higher prices, and in the energy and resources market, this leads to tension and strife for obvious reasons. 15 years ago, the South China Sea was a beautiful but somewhat boring splash of blue on our maps. Now, China, Japan, Vietnam, Taiwan squabble over ownership of the sea because the sea is filled with gas and precious resources, and the booming Asian economies need both. Close by, the same applies to possible gas reserves off the coast of Cyprus, and we've seen the discussion about this in the last couple of days or weeks. Everybody wants to get their hands on that gas as well. As I said, the world can meet the growing demand for energy in the coming decades. That is not the problem. The effects on the environment of the rising demand, however, do pose a serious problem. Climate change will continue to haunt us. By the way, people are now saying, how about global warming? We're freezing in the Netherlands at the end of March. But this is all an aspect of the same problem. Climate will become more erratic. We will see some changes that will lead to global warming, but at the same time have periods of greater cold slots and other problems, a lot of rain and other issues that are all linked to climate change. That's why I tell my kids, it might be freezing cold outside, but that is also climate change. We need to keep that high on our political agenda. It has dropped off that agenda, and that is not good. Despite of all our efforts, over the next 2 decades, 75 to 80% of the world's energy will be supplied by fossil fuels, oil, coal, and gas. Of the three, coal produces by far the highest CO2 emissions, followed by oil, while gas is significantly cleaner. The fastest growing economies, such as China and India, will meet their increased demand mainly by using more coal. 19,000 of the world's 24,000 coal mines are in China. I have great respect for coal. Both my grandfathers were coal miners, so you can see where I come from. Unfortunately, Europe is also running increasingly on coal, and this has a negative impact on Europe's carbon footprint. This is directly linked to what is happening in the American market. Because shale gas is decreasing the price of energy in the United States, coal also becomes cheaper in the United States and thus has a competitive edge on the European market and therefore moves to Europe and creates increasing problems here because the Americans can meet their CO2 reduction targets without any action because of their shift to shale gas, whereas we are increasingly facing problems with our targets because of a shift to coal. Yes, and it's written down what I just said without looking at it. Sorry about that. Skip that part. This is by and large the situation. I wanted to add a couple of remarks on the economic effects. The fact that shale gas has been developed, found in the United States, and is now being explored and exploited, will lead to economic restructuring. It will become more interesting to start producing again in the United States. It will become more difficult to keep production up in Europe. If you look at our main companies, for instance, in the chemical area, and even in the more refined chemical areas such as DSM, the competitive edge they are losing vis-à-vis the United States because of changing energy prices is huge, and is in and by itself an incentive for European companies to move location to the United States. So we have to be very careful that this does not happen, that we do keep a competitive edge. So you have a combination of cheaper energy in the United States, of a tendency of proximity to markets. And this combined is one of the biggest economic restructuring challenges we have seen in the last generation. More competition for energy and other resources threatens our security and the environment. We need to turn the situation around. In particular, we need to work for secured access to energy and resources, prevention of conflicts over natural resources, a global strategy to combat global warming, sustainable growth worldwide. We need to respect the Earth's capacity. CO2 emissions and the use of natural resources such as water should be incorporated into the price of energy. They are left out of any business model today. They should be part of every business model tomorrow. Access to water, food, and energy for all inhabitants of this great planet. Efficient exploration for, trade and in and use of resources. The solution to the problem of this new great game that challenges our security, our environment, and our livelihood can be pursued along a number of tracks. Security of supply is the most important part of our international energy policy. We need to secure our own energy and resources. In part, we do this by contributing to a more stable worldwide energy market, by stimulating gas production in countries such as Tanzania, where new resources were discovered, and other countries like Tanzania. More gas on the market means more competitive gas prices. This diminishes price volatility and the potential for political conflict. The Netherlands has a lot to offer as an expert in sustainable supply chains, governance, international standards and norms for clean energy. We want to underscore this by creating sustainability value in this country. We need to promote a level playing field in the markets for energy and natural resources. More transparency, integrated reporting, and actual playing by the rules to enable our companies to compete fairly worldwide. We face state-owned enterprises that have vertically integrated operations. In other words, they operate the entire chain from mine or source to company, factory, consumer. Because these companies produce for the sole purpose of supplying their own country, they do not participate in the free market, and the country has an incentive to prevent free market from accessing that country. Other countries restrict the export of natural resources. We see other trends of resource nationalism, where governments seize back concessions from foreign investors for domestic political gain or preferential supply of their domestic industries. Also there, if you want to invest in the energy field, these investments are billions of dollars. Over a long period of time, you need to be able to make sure these investments profit. But if you're not sure that your investment will be protected by the country you're investing in, you will likely not want to invest in that country and look for other possibilities. So also the protection of investments is of great importance. The environmental challenge is arguably the biggest challenge we need to face. For this, we need a better understanding of the way energy, food, water, and the environment are interrelated. No one can do this on their own. Here, governments, business, international organizations, NGOs, consumer organizations, academia, and individual citizens will all need to work together if we are to come up with solutions to this most complicated of issues, because it entails that we need to live differently, not just produce differently, trade differently. We need to change the way we live. Shell recently stressed the need for a public debate about the nexus energy, water, food. Sadly, we have no blueprint. We have to learn by doing. Whatever our solution is, there is always some negative butterfly effect. Tapping unconventional sources of energy consumes a lot of water, often in areas where fresh water is already scarce. Biofuels cost a lot in terms of land and water. Fossil fuels produce high CO2 emissions and cause climate change. The market does not address this issue because these effects are not built into the price. So we need governance, public governance at a global level, led by global players, which means that if you look at it from a European perspective, only a common European energy policy will be in a position to be part of those that team of global players that will need to address this issue. Also, we need more innovation. Obviously, we need new effective techniques and approaches. If we are to introduce fracking in areas where there's a dense level of population, you need to find new techniques. Present techniques will not suffice. You need to find techniques where you need less area, where you need less water, and you need to invent, bring this about. You need to think of high-tech information exchange, for example. This could make our transportation more efficient. Imagine sharing a car with your neighbor through an app that tells you exactly when the car is available. Ilko Blok, CEO of KPN, said, in the future, we'll all drive around in smartphones. Really big smartphones, but I do get his point. We also need a lot of innovation in the field of saving energy. Perhaps not in Europe, but where I've traveled worldwide, I have seen how much energy is still spilt simply between the moment it is produced and even until it reaches the consumer, and after that you see so much, a high percentage of that energy being not put to good use. The International Energy Agency recently stressed the enormous potential of saving energy and called it a hidden fuel. Ladies and gentlemen, I began my presentation with Nicolas Sadi-Carnot's book. Incidentally, he was called Sadi by his father because his father was a general in Napoleon's army and fought in Egypt and completely fell in love with Egypt and Egyptian culture, and thus called his son, gave his son an extra name, Sadi, because it wasn't his Christian name, but he added that to the family name. But Nicolas Sadi-Carnot talked a lot with his father after the Napoleonic Wars about strategic issues. He wanted to know, why have we lost this war? And the answer they came up with, and Sadi-Carnot was a scientist by training, mainly interested in gas and the properties of gas. The answer he came up with is because, especially the English, were the first to use fossil fuels as an energy resource to create movement, to create momentum. Very interesting to read that because it's a combination of a military strategist and a scientist trying to look for an answer, and it proves the point that energy and geostrategic questions have always been intimately linked. Growing demand from China and India, American shale gas, and the way we deal with CO2 emissions will not just influence, but arguably shape tomorrow's international relations. You can see it already now. If I'm not mistaken, changing relations on a global scale influence the choice some countries make in concentrating on certain areas in the world where they see greater strategic interest than in others. It is very clear to anyone who's willing to follow this that although the United States and the European Union will still remain for a long time strategic partners, the attention of the American foreign policy will concentrate more on the Indian Ocean and the Far East than it will on Europe, thus creating a greater responsibility for Europe to create more stability within Europe and in its environment. This has everything to do with the fact that the Americans depend less on energy from the Middle East, are more in a position to create their own energy resources, and have diversified. Look at what they did in investing in Western Africa. So there is no distinction between strategic issues and energy issues. How should we go about this? I think there are two routes open to us. Firstly, more than ever before, international cooperation on a global level will determine the difference between failure and success. We need to work with partners who have something to offer and to whom we can offer something in return. For example, we want tin, lithium and gas from East Africa. We can offer Dutch and European technology for clean energy extraction in return. But we also seek cooperation multilaterally in the EU and the EU as such with global and regional organizations. Germany, the United Kingdom and the Netherlands want energy, climate policy, natural resources and water to be put on the agenda of the Foreign Affairs Council in the EU because they all provide strategic risks and strategic opportunities. The EU should cooperate with its neighbours, Russia, Ukraine, Turkey and the wider Mediterranean region, and with organizations such as OPEC and ASEAN. It is clear to me that a unified position by the EU is the best starting position for the EU as a whole and for individual member states. It is very clear to me that if we are not in a position to reach that unified, consolidated position, it will be easy for our partners. I would do the same if I were in their shoes, to play off one member state against the other and thus strengthen their own position. Especially in this very important relationship with Russia, which is almost a relationship of, I would say, mutual interdependency, strategic mutual interdependency. It will be crucial to be firm on those things that are important for Europe, and at the same time to be absolutely clear that only a strategic relationship with Russia can benefit both sides. And there is no distinction, especially when you're talking about natural gas, between supplier and customer. It will be increasingly more difficult to see who depends on whom. And I think interdependency is a relationship of equality. The European Union as customer is not in a weaker position than Russia as provider of energy. Russia as provider of energy should not be in a weaker position as their customer in Europe. Secondly, to protect our environment and our competitiveness, we need to rethink the European climate and energy policy. At this moment, we have the EU 2020 programme. What are its goals? In 2020, we want a 20% CO2 reduction, 20% of our energy from renewables, and we want to be 20% more efficient in energy consumption. Great intentions, but the programme has been overtaken by events. In practice, the EU in 2020, with this programme, it turns out to be too expensive, inefficient, and on a global scale, just a drop in the ocean. It's not helping the environment very much. It's not helping our competitiveness. And according to Dieter Helm, who's the author of The Carbon Crunch, it is not maintainable for the future. It is no coincidence that both Helm and Paul Gilding, author of The Great Disruption, compare decarbonisation to the war industry of the 1930s. it means overhauling some of our most fundamental structures, such as energy plants, industry and transportation. We should be brave and say, if you really want to decarbonize, you will have to pay for it. The International Energy Agency, the European Climate Foundation and the Stern Review have tried to calculate what a reduction of our CO2 emissions of 80% by 2050 would cost. Their answers range from between $300 and $600 billion worldwide per annum. A livable planet doesn't come cheap. So we need to think about life after EU 2020 and ask ourselves important questions. No subjects should be off limits. Do we need a simpler system with one ambitious CO2 emissions goal for the long term? Should we assign a global price to CO2 with one European market for renewable energy and one system of subsidies? We need to have a debate about this, and we need to have that debate on several levels. Nationally, we need to involve governments. But of course, we also need a debate at the EU level with all relevant ministers, the Commission, the European Parliament and other stakeholders. This is such a huge issue because it concerns climate, competitiveness, finance and foreign relations. But none of this will occur if we are not able to do what I said in my first point, create an international platform to attain these goals. I think this is at a time when in many countries we talk a lot about nationalism, about patriotism, about the need to retain our own national sovereignty. In this time, we should come to terms with the fact that these fundamental issues about the structure of our economy, about geopolitical matters, about power relations between continents in the future, if Europe wants to play a role in these matters, it should leave behind discussions about nominal sovereignty and start talking about real sovereignty. And the reinvention of sovereignty in issues such as these can only take place on a European scale. Nation states are too small to, in Europe at least, to create the same power as other nation states who sometimes have the scale of continents can create on their own, such as the United States and China and others. A level playing field in the world with these matters can no longer be created by saying in terms of international law that all states are equal, but by coming to terms with the fact that some states are more equal than others and that you should create a greater equality by cooperating more closely together as European states. Thank you very much for your attention.